That morning the mountains were silent, too silent. Caleb Rinn stepped outside with his rifle, expecting nothing more than the wind through the pines. But what he found hanging from his roof was not a broken branch. It was a woman. Blonde hair tangled in the cold breeze, wrists bound, and across her chest, burned into leather, were two jagged words that would change his life forever. Apache Lover. Who left her there? And why did they want Caleb to see it first? The mountains had always been a place of silence, but that morning the silence felt different. It was heavy, like the whole wilderness was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The old cabin stood alone against the backdrop of endless pine forests, its walls rough-hewn, weathered by years of storms and solitude. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, a thin line against the gray winter sky. Inside, Caleb Rinn, once a soldier but now a recluse, stirred his coffee in a battered tin mug. He liked mornings like this, where nothing stirred except the wind and the distant call of a raven. But that peace was broken by a faint, unnatural sound above his head, the creak of rope under strain. At first, Caleb thought it was a branch knocked loose by the wind, but the sound carried weight, a rhythm that didn't belong to wood. He set his mug down slowly and reached for the rifle leaning against the doorframe. Years of soldiering had left him cautious, unwilling to dismiss any sound in the wilderness. He stepped outside, his boots crunching the frozen earth, and what he saw froze him in place. Hanging upside down from the edge of his porch roof was a young blonde woman. Her hair swayed like a pale banner in the cold breeze, her wrists bound tightly in coarse rope. Her blouse was torn, and across the fabric a crude piece of leather had been branded into her chest. The burned letters were jagged and black, ugly against her pale skin. Apache Lover. Caleb lowered his rifle, but his pulse quickened. Whoever had left her here hadn't just wanted her dead, they wanted her shamed, marked, left as a warning. He knew enough about the land and its tensions to understand the cruelty of it. In this corner of New Mexico territory, branding a woman with those words was worse than cruelty, it was a death sentence. For years, bitterness between settlers and the Apache had been boiling. Accusations of sympathy to the tribe weren't forgiven. They were punished, often in ways meant to echo for generations. Caleb had seen it before. He'd seen it when he was just a boy, when his own sister was accused of helping an Apache boy escape a lynching. She never made it back home. That memory had driven him into solitude, away from towns, away from people, away from the poison of suspicion. And now here it was again, hanging from his roof like a ghost that refused to die. The woman's skin was pale, her face swollen from hanging too long, the blood pooling in her head. Caleb slashed the rope with his knife, catching her limp body before it struck the ground. She weighed almost nothing, light as a breath, her life hanging by a thread. He carried her inside, laying her gently on his bed of rough blankets. Her lips moved faintly, a whisper escaping them, but he couldn't make out the words. He smelled smoke on her, leather, and the sharp edge of fear. Through the day Caleb worked to bring her back. He wrapped her in blankets, set water to her lips drop by drop, coaxing her to swallow. The hours dragged on, and at last, by nightfall, her eyes fluttered open. They were a clear, glassy blue, but there was no gratitude in them. Only caution, the look of someone who had been hunted too long to trust kindness. She looked at him not as a savior, but as another question mark in a world that had betrayed her. Caleb didn't press her with questions. Instead, he ladled stew into a bowl and set it in front of her, letting the warmth of the fire and the quiet of the cabin speak for him. Days turned into weeks. She spoke little, but her silence spoke in other ways. The way she stiffened at the sound of riders in the distance. The way her fists clenched when the coyotes howled at dusk. The way her eyes scanned the tree line, searching for shadows that might not even be there. She was always on edge, as if running even when she sat still. Little by little, fragments of her story emerged. Not in words, but in the things she avoided and the things she held too tightly. Caleb pieced it together like a puzzle scattered in the dirt. She was the daughter of a railroad foreman, raised in a town where the Apache were called savages and treated like ghosts who stole cattle and children. But unlike most, she had seen them differently. She told him in halting words one night, her voice no louder than the crackle of the fire. Once years ago she had found a boy from the tribe, wounded and half dead near the river. She had nursed him back to health in secret, giving him food, water, shelter. She never told anyone, not even her father. For years it was her hidden act of kindness. But secrets have a way of surfacing, and when her town found out, they branded her a traitor. They dragged her into the mountains, beat her, burned those words into her blouse, and hung her from Caleb's roof as a warning to anyone who might think of siding with the enemy. Her hanging was no accident, it was a message. and it was meant for Caleb as much as for her. He had once served in the army units ordered to deal with the Apache, but he had left in disgust after witnessing the bloodshed. Those who had left her here knew his past, and they wanted to remind him that no matter how far he retreated into solitude, the world had not forgotten. Keeping her was dangerous. Caleb knew that. Word would spread. Men would come not with questions but with rifles. And yet each day he found himself more certain he could not send her away. There was something unspoken between them, a shared understanding of what it meant to be marked by the cruelty of others. She bore her brand on her chest. He bore his brand in his memories. When the first snow began to fall, trouble followed. 3 riders appeared on the trail one morning, their coats dusted white, their rifles gleaming in the weak sun. They called out his name, their voices carrying across the frozen stillness, demanding he hand the woman over. She stood behind the door, her fists trembling, breath shallow. Caleb told her to run, to follow the creek until she reached the old mine, but she shook her head. She wasn't going to run again. Running had been her whole life. Now she wanted to stand. The confrontation was sharp, brutal, and quick. Caleb's rifle roared in the thin mountain air, sending the riders scattering. But a shot grazed his side and he staggered. The woman dragged him inside, her small frame carrying a strength born of desperation. She barred the door, tore strips from her own clothing, and bound his wound with hands steady even as her voice shook. 4 hours they listened for hoofbeats, waiting for the threat to return. None came. By spring the riders had not returned. Perhaps they thought Caleb had moved on, or that the mountains had claimed them both. But the woman stayed. She helped repair the roof, tend the goats, plant the small garden out back. She began to smile again, sometimes even laugh, though the scar on her chest never faded. Caleb realized something in those quiet months, that loneliness was not just the absence of people. It was the absence of someone who truly saw you. They had both been outcasts, both scarred by the cruelty of others. But together they found something neither had expected: peace. Their days became a rhythm. Chopping wood, mending fences, planting seeds, cooking simple meals. Nights spent by the fire, telling stories in fragments, laughing softly, sometimes falling silent together. Caleb found himself watching her not with pity but with respect. She was no victim. She had been broken and branded, yet she stood straighter than anyone he had known. And she found in him not a soldier, not a recluse, but a man who had chosen to protect rather than destroy. One evening, as the mountains turned gold with the setting sun, she sat beside him on the porch. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "if the world will forgive us?" Caleb looked out over the endless trees, the horizon fading into shadow. "I don't know," he said softly. "But maybe forgiveness doesn't come from the world. Maybe it comes from finding someone who knows the worst of you and chooses you anyway." She didn't answer, but her hand found his, and that silence said more than words ever could. Seasons shifted, but the bond between them did not. The mountains had once been Caleb's prison of solitude, but with her they became a refuge, a place of second chances. The scars they carried remained, reminders of cruelty and betrayal, but they no longer defined them. Together they carved a new life, proof that even the deepest wounds could be softened by trust, and even the loneliest cabin could hold the warmth of a home. The snow thickened as the weeks went on, burying the mountains in silence. Caleb often rose before dawn, his body moving with old soldier habits, splitting wood until his arms ached. The woman would wake later, moving quietly through the cabin, her hands learning where things belonged as if she had always been there. Her presence changed the rhythm of his days in ways he hadn't expected. For years, the cabin had echoed with nothing but the sound of his boots, his breathing, the wind through the pines. Now there was another heartbeat beside his, another voice breaking the silence. Some nights, when the fire burned low, she told him pieces of her past. Never all at once, never in a way that gave him the whole picture, but in fragments that revealed her life like shards of broken glass. She told him how her father had built his life on steel and track, laying down the iron road that cut across the land. He was a man of pride, who believed the wilderness could be tamed with sweat and guns. He raised her to obey, to see the world through his eyes, but she had never fit that mold. Even as a child, she had questioned why men spoke of the Apache as if they were beasts. When she was 16, she had found the boy, half dead, bleeding near the creek. She couldn't leave him. She hid him in the old barn, sneaking bread and water, binding his wounds with scraps of cloth torn from her dresses. For weeks she nursed him until he could stand again. He never spoke much, just quiet gratitude in his dark eyes before he slipped back into the forest. She thought that was the end of it, her secret kindness tucked away like a pressed flower between pages. But secrets don't stay buried in towns where gossip runs faster than water. Years later, when someone remembered, when someone whispered, the town turned. They called her a traitor, a disgrace to her father's name. The branding was meant to erase her humanity, to reduce her to nothing but a warning. She carried that scar not only on her skin but in her soul. Caleb listened silent. Her words pulled at memories he had long buried. He remembered the night his sister vanished. She had been accused of helping a young Apache boy escape after soldiers came for him. He remembered his father's fury, the shame that spread through their family like wildfire. He remembered the search parties that never returned with her. For years he had carried the weight of wondering what happened. Hearing this woman's story was like reopening an old wound, yet it connected them in a way words could not explain. Both of them had lost someone to the same hatred, both had been marked by it. The winter deepened and survival became their shared mission. Food ran low and Caleb taught her how to set snares in the snow, how to track rabbits, how to chop wood with steady strokes. At night, they huddled close to the fire, sharing warmth in the small cabin. There was no talk of the outside world, no mention of towns or the war that had scarred them. Only the crackle of flames and the steady rhythm of two people learning to live again. Slowly, the hardness in her eyes began to fade. She laughed sometimes, a small, fragile sound that grew stronger with each passing day. But danger was never far. One morning, just as the snow began to melt, Caleb spotted fresh tracks near the ridge. Not deer, not elk, horses. Riders had returned. He didn't tell her at first, not wanting to weigh her down with fear. But she knew. She always seemed to sense when shadows crept near. That night, she sat awake by the window, her shoulders tense, her eyes fixed on the tree-line. "They won't stop," she whispered. "Men like that never stop. They want me dead because I remind them of what they are capable of." Caleb didn't answer, but inside he knew she was right. The men who had hung her from his roof would not forgive his defiance. They would come again, and next time they would not retreat so easily. The second confrontation came at dusk. Caleb had been outside, hauling water from the frozen creek, when he heard the sharp echo of hoofbeats. 3 riders again, but this time they weren't alone, 5 men in total, rifles across their saddles. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, their horses snorting clouds into the cold air. One of them shouted his name, his voice hard and mocking. Caleb ran. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you. Hand her over and maybe we'll let you keep your roof standing." The woman stood in the doorway, her fists clenched, her body shaking. Caleb raised his rifle slowly, his breath steady. He had no illusions. 5 against 1 was near impossible, but he had faced worse odds in battlefields where the sky burned and men screamed. The first shot rang out, shattering the silence, and chaos erupted. Horses reared, rifles cracked, smoke filled the clearing. Caleb dropped one rider with a single clean shot, but another's bullet tore through his shoulder, spinning him back. Pain seared hot, but he held his ground. The woman didn't hide. She grabbed his spare pistol, her hands trembling but her aim steady. The men didn't expect her to fight, didn't expect the branded traitor to raise steel. She fired, the shot wild but close enough to send one rider sprawling from his horse. The others cursed, their confidence faltering. Caleb pushed through the pain, his rifle roaring again, until the air was thick with the echoes of gunfire. By the time the smoke cleared, the survivors had fled into the trees, leaving 2 of their dead in the snow. Caleb staggered, blood soaking his shirt. The woman rushed to him, her hands pressing hard against his wound. "Stay with me," she pleaded, her voice breaking. She dragged him inside, her strength fueled by desperation. Through the long night, she worked to keep him alive, boiling water, stitching flesh with trembling fingers, whispering prayers into the silence. For hours he drifted in and out of darkness, but each time he woke she was there, refusing to let go. When spring finally came, the cabin stood whole, its walls patched, its garden sprouting green. The riders never returned. Perhaps they had lost their will, or perhaps the mountains themselves had decided enough blood had been spilled. Life began again, slowly, tenderly. She tended the goats, her laughter carrying over the fields. He healed, his body scarred but his spirit lighter than it had been in years. Together they rebuilt not just the cabin but themselves. Caleb often thought of the first time he had seen her, hanging from his roof like a cruel omen. He thought of how easily he could have cut her down and sent her away, how much simpler it would have been to turn his back. But he hadn't. Something in him had recognized something in her, an echo, a scar, a shared pain. They had both been marked, both condemned by the world, but together they had found something that neither had expected, redemption. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, she turned to him and said, "Do you believe in second chances?" He looked at her, the firelight catching the scar on her chest, the mark that once defined her. "I do now," he answered. And in that moment, the silence of the mountains no longer felt heavy. It felt alive, filled with the quiet strength of two souls who had survived everything the world had thrown at them, and found in each other the one thing worth living for: peace. The thaw came slowly that year. Snow melted in patches, leaving behind mud and streams that carved new paths through the forest floor. Caleb spent long days outside, leaning on his axe with his shoulder still stiff from the wound, watching the land come alive again. The woman, he still caught himself thinking of her as the woman, though she had long since told him her name, Eliza, took to the work as if she had always belonged there. She planted seeds in neat rows, her hands stained with earth, humming tunes from her childhood. Some nights he asked her what the words meant, and she would smile faintly, saying they were just songs her mother used to sing, long before hatred drowned the town in suspicion. Their life became one of small rituals. In the mornings, Caleb fetched water while Eliza stoked the fire. At noon they worked side by side, he mending fences, she tending goats. In the evenings they read aloud from the few old books Caleb had kept from his soldiering days. She laughed at his gruff voice stumbling over poetry, and he found himself laughing too, the sound strange in his own ears after so many years of silence. He began to realize that healing wasn't only about flesh knitting back together, it was about laughter returning to a place that had forgotten it. But the scars were never far. Some nights Eliza woke in a cold sweat, her body rigid, eyes wide as if she were still hanging from the roof. Caleb would sit with her until dawn, listening as she spoke of the faces in the crowd that had condemned her. "They weren't strangers," she whispered once, her voice breaking. "They were people I grew up with, people who watched me play in the fields, who knew my name. And still they did that to me." Caleb had no easy words. He only took her hand and held it until her trembling stopped. He knew too well what it was like to be betrayed by your own. As spring turned to summer, the cabin no longer felt like a refuge for one man but like a home for two. They built a small pen for chickens, cleared a patch for corn, and set stones in the creek to make a crossing. The land, once a prison of solitude, became alive with their labor. Eliza began to smile more often, her laughter no longer fragile but full, echoing across the fields. Caleb watched her and thought that perhaps the world had not taken everything from them after all. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching thunderclouds gather over the ridge, Eliza turned to him. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked. Caleb's brow furrowed. "Leaving?" She nodded. "The mountains, the cabin, all of it. Do you ever wonder what it would be like to walk into a town and not be hunted by shadows?" He thought about it for a long moment, then shook his head. "The world out there already judged us, branded us. Out here, the land doesn't ask who you were, only who you are willing to be." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and in that quiet agreement, they let the storm roll over them. By autumn, the valley was golden, the trees painted in fire and amber. Travelers passed through the ridge now and then, merchants on their way west or hunters chasing elk. Some saw the cabin smoke and kept their distance. Others stopped for water, exchanging wary glances but saying little. None spoke of the riders who had once come for Eliza. Word must have spread that the mountains weren't worth the trouble. Caleb sometimes wondered if peace was real, or if it was only the pause between storms. But each day he woke and found Eliza there, feeding the goats, laughing at the chickens, humming as she worked. He decided it didn't matter. Peace wasn't a promise from the world. It was the choice to keep living even when the world tried to take everything from you. One evening, as the first snow of the next winter fell soft and quiet, Caleb sat by the fire, watching Eliza mend a torn shirt. The firelight caught the scar on her chest, the brand that had once defined her. She noticed his gaze and touched it lightly, almost without thought. "It'll never fade," she said softly. "No," Caleb agreed. "But maybe it doesn't have to. Maybe it's not a mark of shame anymore. Maybe it's a mark of survival." She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time since he had cut her down from that rope, she smiled without hesitation. Outside, the mountains lay silent, not in mourning but in peace. And for the first time in years, Caleb felt that the silence was no longer heavy. It was a silence filled with possibility, with a fragile, stubborn hope that two people broken by cruelty could still build something whole together. The world had tried to brand them as outcasts, but the mountains had given them back to themselves. And that, Caleb thought, was more than enough.